I'm Mark Powell. Welcome to another edition of AP's Profile in Christian Living. Today we have a special guest with us, Professor Cam Clousing, who's the new lecturer at Christ College here in Sydney. Welcome, Cam. It's great to have you with us.
It's good to be with you.
Now, we're going to very quickly see that you've got a peculiar accent. Tell us, where are you from? And tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so born and raised in the United States, born in Wisconsin, so the northern part of the U.S. In the U.S., we would say that you have the peculiar accent, but we'll debate that later. But yeah, so born and raised in Wisconsin, lived in Chicago for a bit, where I did my undergraduate work at Moody Bible Institute. Lived in Northern California, and then from Northern California was down in Bogota, Colombia, where I worked as a missionary with Mission to the World, the sending arm of the Presbyterian Church in America. It was in Bogota that I met my wife and got married.
And your wife's an Aussie.
My wife is an Aussie. It's the beautiful story of American boy meets Australian girl in South America. Everybody has a story like that, right?
That's right. It's a love story.
It's a love story. And then we ended up moving to the southern part of the U.S., where I served as a minister just outside of Nashville in Franklin, Tennessee, at a small church called Parish Presbyterian Church. And I worked as a minister in the Presbyterian Church in America there. For about 9 years, so
wow.
Quite a long time with this congregation, both working full time with the congregation and then also for 3 years doing my PhD at the University of Edinburgh. They supported us while we were doing that.
So many things to talk to you about today. I've got to really think in my head very carefully, where do we start? I've got to ask you this question. I'm looking at the color of your skin.
Yeah.
And I'm just thinking, you don't look like you're from Tennessee. What's your background culturally?
Yeah. So my biological father is from the Middle East, Qatar. So I am part Arab, half Arab, and then my mom is your normal German American who grew up in Wisconsin eating bratwurst and going to Catholic church. So
right.
Yeah.
So Arabic father,
yeah,
German American mother,
yeah,
raised Roman Catholic for a bit.
My mom was when the year that I was born, she actually became a Christian. And in Wisconsin, you're either Catholic or Lutheran. So we started going to a Lutheran church as soon as I was born. I was baptized into the Lutheran church. My biological father, as soon as he found out my mom was pregnant, actually moved back to the Middle East. He was betrothed to be married in the Middle East.
Wow.
And went back immediately. And I've never met him. So when I was 6, my mom met another man. And they fell in love, got married, and he adopted me. And he is the only father I've ever known, and the man that I to this day call father.
Wow. It's a fascinating background. So how did you become a Presbyterian?
Yeah, that's a great question too. Through I always joke that when I went to Moody Bible Institute, I learned how to read the Bible. And as I learned to read the Bible, I also was reading the Westminster Confession of Faith and reading theologians like R.C. Sproul, as we say in the U.S. I think you guys say Sproul.
Yeah, it's with the R. You'll get it.
But R.C. Sproul and John Stott and J.I. Packer. I'm reading these guys while I'm also reading the Bible, and just realized, after about my first year of college, I just said, I think I'm Reformed, and I think I'm actually a Presbyterian. So all those things together just caused me to push further and further into the Reformed tradition, into the Westminster Confession of Faith, the Puritans, early modern Reformed thinkers like John Owen, reading Calvin, so Augustine, who was Reformed but didn't realize it just yet. So all of those influences in my early years of academic work caused me to realize I'm a Presbyterian. And then after college, I ended up at a Presbyterian Church in America church in Northern California, where my journey with the PCA America started.
And now, as you just said before, you've just spent 3 years in Edinburgh in Scotland doing your PhD on Bavinck.
Yeah.
So there's nobody at the moment in the world more Presbyterian than you, I would think. You become one of the world's leading scholars now on Bavinck.
Yeah, I mean, it's a small group of Bavinck scholars. So I guess anybody in that group is one of the world's leading scholars on Bavinck.
Yeah, but he's become so popular.
Yeah.
Like he's amongst anybody in the Reformed faith in the last, I think, decade.
Yeah.
There's been a Bavinck renaissance. Why is that?
Yeah, I actually just heard Carl Trueman say that he thinks that in the modern era, there is not another Reformed theologian with the orthodox sensibilities as Bavinck, and saying that Bavinck is really working and living in the midst of a time where the world is changing, and it's really modernity in its fullest form is starting to flourish, and Bavinck is one of these thinkers that is endeavoring to be orthodox while at the same time understanding the culture around him and going, okay, how do I continue to remain orthodox in the midst of this changing culture, and then on top of that, even asking the question, how do I remain a Christian and thinking Christianly in every sphere of life? So if I'm going to be a scientist, what does it mean to think about science in a Christian way? If I'm going to be a mathematician, what does that mean to think about mathematics in a Christian way? These are fields that oftentimes when we think about it nowadays, we think, well, math is just this very neutral thing. It has nothing to do with Christianity. But Bavinck would say, no, actually, there's a Christian way to be a mathematician. There's a Christian way to be a scientist.
Okay, flesh that out practically. What does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think first and foremost, it's recognizing the one who is giving order to this world. It's understanding that mathematics is done to the glory of God, when in fact we understand that mathematics is a gift that is given to us by God. So there's a way in which we can be good mathematicians, and Bavinck wouldn't say that you can't be a mathematician and not be a Christian. He would say, yeah, there are plenty of good non-Christian mathematicians, but a Christian mathematician understands the end for which math was created, and it was created for the purpose of worshiping and glorifying God.
Yeah, I think it reminds me of Newton's Principia Mathematica.
Yeah.
He has a foreword in there, or a dedication to the glory of God. That effectively, he writes it like it's an evangelistic tract.
Yeah.
Whereas I saw maths growing up as something to be saved from. He saw it as actually an apologetic for God and his order in the universe.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, really what it is it's a fleshing out of what Luther talks about as like the priesthood of all believers, in that you can be a Christian and be a street sweeper. And this is a good and noble calling. Not everybody needs to go off and be a pastor to be called into some sort of vocation that can be Christian.
See, that's interesting.
Christianly.
So does Bavinck have a very robust view of Christian vocation?
Yeah, I mean, I think he does, in that he's really engaged in asking, especially later on in his life, as he moves to Amsterdam from Kampen, a small town, to the big city. As he moves from being in a theological training center, much like Christ College, where I teach now, into a university at the Free University of Amsterdam. His life transitions. He finishes his Reformed Dogmatics, so his major work of theology, as he heads over to Amsterdam. He then finishes a second edition of it, and while he's doing that second edition, and while he's engaging in life in Amsterdam, he's also becoming more and more engaged in politics. He's becoming more and more engaged in science and thinking through things like pedagogy. I mean, this isn't stuff that he wasn't doing before in Kampen, but you find a more robust thinking about the application of the Christian life to every sphere of life, and thinking about Christian worldview and what these things mean.
So there'll be a lot of people watching this or hearing this and thinking, I heard Bavinck.
Yeah.
I'm keen. I'm interested to get into Bavinck.
Yeah.
It seems to me, I've tried reading Bavinck, and he's like John Owen.
Yeah.
He's great, but he's hard.
Yeah.
what's some good books as an introduction to Bavinck that you'd recommend?
Yeah. So I mean, there's a couple places that we could start. I think first of all, just to understand like the life in which this man lived. I mean, he's a late 19th, early 20th century thinker. Quite possibly the most important Reformed theologian post Calvin.
Yeah, that's what I've heard.
And he is this thinker who has a breadth of knowledge. So a good place to start, just to get an understanding of his life, is a brand new biography that's just come out by James Eglinton, who is my PhD supervisor.
Okay.
James wrote this great biography, kind of navigating the life of Bavinck, so that as you walk into some of his works, you kind of can understand then, okay, what's happening in his life that has propelled him into this world. But I mean, for the average person in the pew, the person that hasn't gone to seminary and studied this stuff for a living, I think a great place to start would be Bavinck's Wonderful Works of God. It's actually just been reprinted by Westminster Seminary Press. It's a great place to start your foray into his theology. I actually, with a friend of mine at the University of Edinburgh, translated a book on Bavinck's understanding of the need for Christian confession called The Sacrifice of Praise. And it's about meditations before and after you've taken the Lord's Supper for the first time. So it's really the necessity of confessing the name of Christ in all areas of your life.
And when you say you've translated this is from the original Dutch, isn't it?
Yeah, it's from Dutch. So we translated that. Another place, it's not out yet, but Lord willing, if I continue doing the work that needs to be done, my friend Greg and I are also in the process of translating a book called Handlighting, or Bavinck's Instruction in the Christian Faith. Whereas
this is the one for high school students.
This is a one volume,
theology.
yeah. So whereas
that's the one I'm keen on.
Yeah. Whereas the Wonderful Works of God was written for somebody that's a professional class churchgoer but still a layperson. The one Handlighting, the Instruction in the Christian Faith, was written for late high school, early college age students, and really for the idea of making systematic theology, or dogmatic theology probably better, accessible to them. Yeah.
So now there's a lot of systematic theologians around.
Yeah.
Right. There's some great ones.
Yeah.
What is it about Bavinck's approach that you think is unique and particularly helpful?
Yeah. I mean, so if we think about something like Reformed Dogmatics, which is his 4-volume magnum opus in a lot of ways of systematics, he is thoroughly biblical. I mean, the man, this was, as a friend of mine has said, this was before you had all of the Bible study software that you can use, like Logos and BibleWorks, where you can just go type something in. He knew his Hebrew, he knew his Greek, he knew Aramaic. He knew Latin, French, German, English,
Dutch.
I mean, he was brilliant. And when you read Reformed Dogmatics, you get this sense that he is thoroughly biblical and knows his Bible well. But then he's also incredibly well versed in his own tradition. So he knows Reformed theology from Calvin to the present day for him. So the late 19th, early 20th century, and you can just turn to any page and find that. But you can also find the people with whom he's disagreeing and what they're saying. And he's one of the most ironic people you can read, in that as you're reading, I've often found myself mistakenly like agreeing with something, going, yeah, that's true. And then the next page turning and going, oh, Bavinck is disagreeing with that. But he's
being so gracious.
He lays out his opponent's points so well,
right,
that you can be convinced by it. And that's really, really helpful. So his breadth of knowledge is amazing. And then when you get into his more popular works, the way in which he's trying to think through, how do I write this in a devotional way, a way that allows you to sing the praises of God. I mean, this is what I love. At the end of chapter 2 of volume 1 of Reformed Dogmatics, he says what the purpose of theology is. And he says that the purpose of theology is to lead us to doxology, that is, to singing the praises of God. So what theology should ultimately be is learning how to sing the praises of God. It really echoes what J.I. Packer says when J.I. Packer says that any theology that does not lead to song is at its heart faulty.
Wow.
And I think that's really what Bavinck wants to do. He wants to be thoroughly grounded in the Bible, while at the same time holding the confession of his church high and saying, this is what we believe as Reformed theologians, but then ending with, and this is how it applies into our daily contemporary lives. Now, the way in which he's going to apply it is going to be different because he lived in a different time and a different place than the way we will. But there's ways in which he brings it into conversation with questions that are looming in the late 19th and early 20th century. That are really helpful.
He's very gracious with his opponents. I've also heard anybody that's really studied Bavinck is just in awe of his knowledge, his grasp of the scriptures and systematic theology. Is there anything you disagree with Bavinck on?
There's always, you have to read a person critically. I think some of the areas in which he starts to make some connections. So my area of expertise when it comes to Bavinck is his theological methodology, and particularly then applying it to his Trinitarian theology. So how he understands the Trinity. He is orthodox throughout in his Trinitarian theology. There's no question about that. The only area in which he starts to have some issues, I think, is when he starts to apply some modern psychological categories to the divine essence. So he at one point says that God in his being is absolute personality.
Okay.
And starts to kind of push the persons of the Trinity back into the essence of God, as opposed to having he doesn't do that necessarily, but there's some ways in which you start looking at him and going like, okay, there's some issues here that one needs to be careful about.
But he is careful of it.
I don't know that he doesn't flesh out what he means necessarily fully. So I think that he opens up doors that then later 20th century theologians will end up walking down when we start dealing with things like if anybody's heard of social Trinitarianism, wherein the divine essence tends to be more about the mutual cooperation between the three persons.
Okay, so we're getting into some deep stuff here.
Yeah.
So really what you're saying, the lesson to be learned here is if you're going to go down those corridors and open those doors, you've got to make sure you shut them as well. If they're leading to unhelpful corridors.
Yeah, I guess. I think at the same time as well, it's important to go down those. I think it's often important to go down new paths. And I don't know that Bavinck necessarily saw the where this would lead, where conversations surrounding psychological categories and the divine essence would lead. So I don't fault him for not shutting those doors. And I think part of the job of, if we are Reformed and we believe that we are Reformed, always reforming, then we should constantly be asking the question, okay, how does my theology apply to the modern world?
And that was Bavinck's task, wasn't it? Like you said before.
And I think that that's our task as well. Like we don't live in the time of the Westminster Divines, so our job isn't to just go and recapitulate what the Westminster Divines said. Our job is to ask the question: how does what Westminster gives us? How do we communicate that? How do we translate that into a new context?
So stepping back just one.
Yeah.
Bavinck lived over 100 years ago.
Yeah.
And ministered. And did a superb job from what you've said, applying Reformed confessional biblical theology to his day.
Yeah.
What benefit do we have of reading Bavinck in his day for our day?
Yeah, I think he gives us a paradigm for understanding a couple things. For understanding, how you stay confessionally orthodox while also trying to engage with a modern culture. And especially like in the Netherlands, an increasingly secularized culture, even in his day, wherein Christians just didn't have became less and less the majority, and in fact, by the time he dies, are pretty much out of power in the Netherlands.
What's going on there? What
I mean, we have to
in the
understand
wider culture of the Netherlands?
I mean, you have to understand that the Netherlands was one of the first countries to decouple the church from the state, to the point where it almost never had an established church. So throughout Bavinck's life, his denomination, which is really the Orthodox and confessionally faithful denomination, is grappling with how do we stay faithful in the midst of this increasingly secularized culture. I mean, there's even questions inside of the wider culture. There's a call to secularize theology. One of Bavinck's contemporaries argues that, in fact, the church no longer is needed. The only thing the church is needed for is to do diaconal work, and even the state can do that better than the church. So why the church isn't even needed for that anymore?
That sounds very similar, scarily, to the Australian situation.
I mean, I think it sounds pretty similar to most of Western society. I mean, you even hear this in the U.S. So I think that what Bavinck helps us to do is understand. He gives us a paradigm for how do we understand ourselves in the midst of a secularized culture. How do we continue to remain faithful? How do we preach the gospel into this secularized culture in a way that I think many of the late 19th, early 20th century theologians aren't doing. You don't really see this happening in England all that much, amongst Protestants at least. You could probably look at John Newman, Cardinal Newman, a bit. You don't really see it happening in America. The Princetonians are asking different questions, and oftentimes are very unnuanced in their understanding of how culture, Christianity and culture interact with one another. You end up, but you do end up having these questions asked with Bavinck. Bavinck is just very much interested in trying to walk this rope, and I think it's because his denomination is trying to figure this out. His denomination is trying to figure out what do we do in the midst of this.
Okay, so really, what you're going to now do in starting up your new ministry at Christ College, lecturer in pastoral theology and...
Yeah, it's the lecture in applied theology and missional engagement.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's a mouthful.
Yeah, but it's really taking up the baton from what Bavinck was really trying to achieve through his dogmatics. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is, in a lot of ways, studying Bavinck has given me the ability to take up this position. I think if I had studied anybody else, it would have been a lot harder for me to really understand how to do this. I mean, Bavinck, even his nephew, he teaches his nephew at the university, at the Free University, and his nephew J.H. Bavinck goes on to be one of the most important missionaries to Indonesia. And really applies Bavinck's theology to missiology, and so I think that what in a very real sense what's happening, what I'm able to do at Christ College, and I'm really excited about it, is apply Bavinck's sensibilities to the role of being involved in applied theology and missional engagement. So, yeah, I do think that in a lot of ways I'm picking up on Bavinck's threads and following Bavinck's tradition.
So we need to have this conversation in a year's time after you've been here. We've only been here less than a month.
No, just over a month now.
Okay, yeah. You were in quarantine.
We were in quarantine for 2 weeks.
Oh, my gosh. And now, so... The challenge, what do you think? I know you've only been here a month, right?
Yeah.
But you're coming in, you're going to be the new lecturer in the new year at Christ College. What's your goals for the students? How are you going to equip them missiologically to engage with our culture?
Yeah. I was talking to a couple of my colleagues at the college the other day about this, and I said that I think that more than anything, what we need to be doing at the college, and what I kind of view my job as doing, is preparing people to go out into the world and be evangelists. We don't want to prepare students to leave Christ College who are just going to go into a church and maintain what the church already has. there are a lot of people that can maintain a work. What we need in Australia, in America, wherever we go, if students go to Vanuatu or wherever they end up, what we need is evangelists, because what I love the Psalm where you read David saying that his soul thirsts and hungers for God, and then he looks at the temple of God. He sees the glory of God, and beholding the glory, he's satisfied. And I this is what we do every Lord's Day when we gather to worship. And this is what we are called to then do when we go out into the world, which is to tell a world that is hungry and thirsty, but doesn't realize that they're hungry and thirsty, that they are hungry and thirsty. And our job then my job is to help students, train students to communicate in such a way that they tell their neighbors, their friends, that they tell the community in which they find themselves planted, no, actually you are hungry and thirsty. And here's where you can go to have your hunger and thirst satisfied. The world is the world, and I mean, in Australia, people are drinking sand. They're in the midst of the desert and they're drinking sand, thinking it's going to quench their thirst. But what the gospel promises is that gazing upon the glory of God, hearing the gospel, and grasping hold of that is the only place that our hunger and thirst can be satisfied. And my job, I think, as lecturer in applied theology, is to help students think through, okay, how do I say that? How do I say that to my neighbor? How do I help the person down the street from my church see that whatever they find, whatever they're using to satisfy their thirst, whether it be work, family, sport, is not going to satisfy that. It's never going to tell me that I'm enough. It's always going to demand more. And what the gospel says is that, in fact, what you think is enough is never going to be enough, but Christ is. And I think that that's really what I hope to see my students, when my students leave, I hope to see them catching a glimpse of that and learning how to think in that way. They won't leave as experts, but I want to give them the tools to be able to start thinking about, okay, how do I go out of this? How do I go out and talk to my friends and neighbors? And how can I be an evangelist in the world in which the Lord places me?
So picking up on that, Cam, how is that theology practically applied?
Yeah. I mean, I think some of the ways that we can think about that. I mean, I think theology. I was just looking at Kevin Van Hooser's book, Doers and Hearers. It might be, Doers and Hearers. He in that he talks about theology as exercise and learning how to do like core exercises. And really what theology does is it gives you those core exercises so that you can then go out into the world and know how to do functional movements. So I learn how to lift weights in the gym so that I can go pick up a box at my house. And so the theology that we learn in our systematic theology classes, the theology that I'll teach at my students, is all so that they can then go out and say, okay, well, how does a doctrine of the image of God in man help me think about things like the homeless person that sleeps outside of our church, or the single mom who's struggling to take care of her kids. So how does Trinitarian theology help me think then about something like the way in which the body of Christ functions as a bunch of individual people, but yet united to one another through the blood of Christ. So how does all of this stuff help us think about worship in our church? So I think applied theology allows me to be a generalist in that I get to talk about everything. I get to talk about everything from systematics to pastoral theology. So how do you preach? How do you do pastoral counseling? To apologetics. How do we defend the gospel in the midst of a culture that is incredibly antagonistic to the gospel?
Now, you're married to an Aussie, and I
am.
know you're only new, but what differences do you think you're going to find being in the Australian church context to, say, the American or even the Scottish.
Yeah. I mean, I think that I think we can start out with saying you guys all talk different. So
We talk proper.
what was it? I can't remember who said it, but I think it was there was a famous quote that is Australia and the UK are two countries separated by a common language. So now I think that one of the, I mean, everything from understanding church history of Australia, understanding different ways in which Australians identify themselves. I mean, to be evangelical in the U.S. is very different from what it means to be evangelical in Australia.
Okay, what does it mean in the US to be evangelical?
I think there's a lot of political components.
It means
to what
be
it
Republican?
Means. For some, yeah. There's some reasons. There are a lot of reasons why in the U.S. I stopped identifying as evangelical. Not that I didn't theologically agree with evangelicals, but all of the questions surrounding evangelicalism tended to be Baptist questions. And I oftentimes would listen to people say, "Well, you're an evangelical," and then they'd ask me a question. I'd be like, "Yeah, I'm not a Baptist. I don't have a dog in that fight." So I think that at the same time, so to be evangelical in Australia is different from being evangelical in the U.S. I think as well, the polity in the Australian Presbyterian Church is just very different from the polity in the American, the Presbyterian Church in America.
That's interesting. You got to explain that.
Well, I mean, you guys have a federalized system, so each state has its own General Assembly, and then your National General Assembly only meets once a year.
Oh, once every 3.
Once every 3 years. Yeah. Sorry, yeah. Our General Assembly is for the entire country, and it meets once a year. Our denomination tends to be very grassroots. The Presbyterian Church in America tends to be very grassroots, ground up. As I've understood and talked to people more, it seems that the structure in the Presbyterian Church of Australia tends to be much more top down. While each individual congregation has a form of autonomy, it's much less so than in the American Presbyterian Church.
Well, because something you were telling me the other day, which you were shocked by, is the Property Trust Act. Yeah. Whereas in America, each congregation owns their own property. Yeah. Whereas in Australia, we don't. Yeah. It's owned by the trustees. Yeah. Who we are on very good terms with, by the way. But what difference do you think that makes to the psyche of the church?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to speak without too much knowledge, so I'm going to be careful here because I'm also trying to join the Presbyterian Church of Australia, and I want people to like me. But I mean, I think that to some degree, in the U.S., I'll just talk about the U.S., it just makes churches a lot more autonomous and a lot more willing to pull out when they've decided that they're fed up with the denomination.
Do you find many churches do that?
I think it's happening more and more these days. More and more churches are just willing to say, you know what, I'm not going to deal with the politics of the Presbyterian Church in America, which is unfortunate. I think that it ends up making some of our vows a little less. It makes you feel like your vow isn't nearly as strong. So
because if you just don't like it, you can leave.
Well, yeah. If you decided that like everything's going downhill, and there's nothing I can do to help reform, we just go, okay, I'm leaving, or everything's not moving in the right direction for me, so I'm just gonna disappear and go with my congregation somewhere else.
See, ironically, I wonder whether it actually adds weight to your vows because you can leave. Yeah. Whereas I'm going to go into controversial territory here. I wonder whether there's a saying in Australia, a denomination's a good boat to fish off. Yeah. So there's a pragmatism that comes in. Yeah. And people sort of cross their fingers, allude to the declaratory statement, and then just have an uneasy affiliation.
Yeah, I guess I think about things like the peace and purity of the church, those types of vows, wherein inside of the Presbyterian Church in America, it's easy to just say, you know what, I'm not going to fight this battle, and I'm just going to leave, and unless you really aren't fulfilling your vow to care for the purity of the church, and you're leaving. Oftentimes, you leave in such a way that you don't really care about the peace of the church either. So I think that oftentimes we can be flippant with those types of vows. I think you might be right. I don't really know. Once again, I don't know the Australian context nearly as well, but I do think you can probably run into issues where, in the Australian context, that you've decided I don't necessarily agree with this church's doctrine anymore, but rather than lose our building, we'll just stay here, which is unfortunate as well. I think both systems have their benefits and also their problems. It's that truism that our greatest strength is oftentimes our greatest weakness.
Yeah, very true.
And I think that the PCA in America's greatest strength is the fact that it's a grassroots denomination. It's also the greatest weakness of our denomination. And perhaps the greatest strength of your denomination is that because you have such a tight structure from the top, you can hold things together, but it can also be a weakness in the sense that you can lose some of your Presbyterian distinctives if you're not careful.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, look, it's been great chatting. I'm sure we could chat more, and I hope that we will.
Well, you're my pastor, so,
yeah, that's right.
So we end up talking all the time.
I know. But thank you so much for joining us. It's been great. We look forward to chatting with you some more. Definitely, we should pencil it in now for a year's time. A year's reflections on the next 12 months and what's happened in that time and how your perceptions might have confirmed or even changed during that time.
Yeah, I'd love that. That'd be great.
Excellent. Well, this has been Mark Powell for AP's Profiles in Christian Living. I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and we look forward to seeing you next time on our show. Thanks.